Today's purpose is to share knowledge and keep information flowing. Our jobs are to continue to keep public safety officers safe. This morning's first speaker is Joe Blaster from Washington State. Joe's a registered professional engineer in 8 states and the principal and founder of ADCOM Engineering. Prior to starting ADCOM in 1979, he worked for Motorola and a small telephone equipment electronics manufacturer. Joe's been engineering and installing Simulcast since the early 70s. ADCOM Engineering has worked on over 500 communications projects, ranging from low-band paging systems to 900 megahertz trunk systems. Joe has freely shared his information with us since the first forum 20 years ago. This morning's information will be some of Joe's experience with RF coverage and optimizing Simulcast. Some systems now optimize automatically, but it's still important for us to know what's going on under the hood and managing the real-world aspect of once those systems do their job, what happens out over the air and coming to the mobiles and portables. Please welcome Joe.
Good morning, everybody. Ed said at the beginning of this that, from an emergency standpoint, just follow the light. You get to my age and somebody tells you to look for the light, and you have a problem. I should just be a little careful there. Obviously, I started doing simulcast in kindergarten. I'm not really as old as I look. So, anyway, this is. One of the things I find, so I get calls on and off over the years, or each year. It seems like every year I get 3 or 4, maybe more calls from people that are trying to implement simulcast, and they're running into some sort of a problem. Usually, unfortunately, I get the call, after they've already deployed the system, and then they say, well, we're out doing this and we're out doing that, and we're trying to figure out what's wrong. And I said, well, give me the symptoms. I try to, help them over the phone. If it's only a little bit of time, I don't charge for that. I really like Simulcast, and I think it's the great technology. So I try to help people along. But what I find a lot of times is by the time they're calling me, it's almost too late, right? I mean, they've already designed the system, got it installed, and done all that. So hopefully today I'm going to, this is sort of just a quick review of those, of some of that, some of the things that you really need to pay attention to. And then talk a little bit about optimizing systems. So the big thing here is that with Simulcast, and it's even worse now that we've moved to digital, is you need to figure out how to use the tools that are available instead of driving around. Driving around and optimizing Simulcast systems is a very difficult, and in digital it's virtually impossible way to adjust Simulcast. You just can't do it. And maybe if you have 2 sites and you're an analog, you can do it, but you get 3 or 4 sites, you can spend an unbelievable amount of time driving around trying to figure out how to make it work. The other thing we see a lot of is that people are not using the right antennas. And this is particularly true for people that are using sites that are higher, but it's not always. I mean, we've done some work for North Carolina and some places like that where the problem is it's relatively flat, right? But you drive up on an overpass, and now you can see that site 60 miles or 70 miles away, right? Well, that site, if it's putting very much RF in there, is going to cause a problem for your simulcast system. So it's not just the people in the mountainous areas. So all of us have experienced, when we live in the city, maybe the only people that don't experience this is if you're in a very flat area and in the rural areas, you don't have a lot of multipath. But anybody that lives in the cities, anybody that lives in mountainous areas, multipath is a huge problem. And so we can kind of see how this works. You get a reflection off the buildings, could be off the mountains. You get a signal that goes to your user there, and there's 3 different paths. And when you're driving around, you can hear this, right? It causes mobile flutter. That's what really causes mobile flutter in a mobile environment is multipath. And The issue with simulcast, though, is we're creating multipath, right? I mean, that's really what it's all about. But we want to control it. That's the difference. Instead of just, regular base station, you get mobile flutter, you get fuzzy audio, you get all that sort of stuff. We're trying to control it with simulcast. So really, what we're doing in simulcast is creating co-channel multipath. Now, the good news is, in simulcast, we're using the multipath to our benefit, or trying to use the multipath to our benefit, not against us. But we can't get rid of it totally. We're just trying to control it. The thing that causes the problem, though, is that in our receivers, those signals mix. Even if we're not really hearing it, those different signals, so you get 3 or 4 different signals, they mix in our receivers, and there's a lot of non-linearities in the receivers. RF amplifier in the front end is not linear, so you get 3 or 4 signals that come in there. They're on the same frequency or virtually on the same frequency. There's slight time delay, and so it adds additional distortion in the receiver. And then you go to the mixer, you get more distortion, and then you go to the IF. In the old days, that process through the receiver was pretty well defined because it was all analog, right? I mean, you had, real amplifiers, and you had crystal filters, and you had, some sort of discriminator for those of us old enough to remember all that stuff. Nowadays, it goes into a mixer, and it comes out in, it goes into a digital receiver, basically. There's nothing analog in it. So the receivers are in DSPs, which can be deployed in different ways depending on the manufacturer. The problem is the output and how that simulcast affects that audio is less well defined now than it used to be. So sometimes you find one brand of radio will work better than another brand of radio, even though it seems like they should all be the same. So on the analog side, we've talked about this before, and this is critical, right? The received audio signals need to be within 30 degrees of each other. Well, what does that mean, right? That's how we determine the timing that's required. So we're going to use, so typically when we design systems, at least at the start, unless we have other information about it, we use 1,000 hertz, right? It's easy, so that's why we use it. So if we take 1,000 hertz and figure out how many, using that as a reference, it turns out that 1,000 hertz has, 1 millisecond period, so again, it's pretty easy to divide. And if we take 30 degrees, that's 1/12 of 360 degrees, and we divide 1 millisecond by 12, and we come up with 83 microseconds, excuse me. That's kind of our magic number, right? We don't want to exceed a time delay, we'll talk about where in a minute, more than 83 microseconds. Now, the reality of it is, in some instances, you can get away with more in analog. We'll talk about digital in a minute, because digital is more restrictive. And sometimes you can get away with less, because if you're in a highly multipath environment already, you may find that, not just from the simulcast overlap, but now you've got bounces off mountains, that can create additional problems. So it's not, there's no hard and fast rule there, but you really can't, if you're going to try to exceed that, you're probably going to have problems. But here's the real issue. So people will wonder, well, how accurate, for example, do I have to time my CTCSS? Well, if you look at this, at 200 hertz, that 30 degrees is 420 microseconds. You almost don't have to worry about it. I mean, I would say you don't have to worry about CTCSS, because obviously if you get it inverted, you're going to have problems. But CTCSS is not really a problem in terms of aligning it. You're not going to run out of overlap area on CTCSS. What is a problem, though, are paging tones. And it's especially a problem for anybody that's still using old plectron tones. I mean, I still find it hard to believe that people are still using them, but plectron had tones that were up around 1900 hertz, for example, 2000 hertz. I think there were some even more than that. And at 2000 hertz, your maximum is 42 microseconds. That's a lot different. So people will sometimes find that they put a system in and the audio sounds okay, but the paging doesn't work. And that's usually why you find out. Then you ask them a question, well, are you using the old plectron tones? Oh yeah, we're using the plectron tones. Okay, well, that's the problem. You need to change, go to quick call 2, go to some other paging format and use lower frequency tones. And so we run into this a fair amount. So why is 30 degrees the maximum? So you can see from these plots, so at the top, That's what it looks like if we're at 30 degrees. But look how fast it deteriorates. So there's 35 degrees, right? The second one there. So you can start to see distortion in the audio, but look what happens when you get to 45 degrees. The audio doesn't sound at all or look at all like it would at 30 degrees. And so it's really noticeable if you were to set this up in a lab and you were to change your phase of the audio, you can detect it it is pretty noticeable. Now, the problem with just listening to it, though, is your ear is actually pretty good at compensating for audio distortion. The brain's developed over millions of years. The problem is electronics is not so good at tolerating this. So if you're doing paging tones, for example, the pager doesn't like that 45-degree audio distortion level there very well. And so that makes the whole paging thing even worse and more critical. So when you run out of time, out of phase there. So on digital, we got the same issue, right? So if we look at digital, but it's more restrictive. So this is basically C4 FM or phase 1 digital. Here's phase 2 right here, LSM or WQPSK. You can see that you've got much more delay spread if you're using linear simulcast or the sort of equivalent there. So at about 2.5% bit error rate, you're at about 65 microseconds, maybe, about 70 microseconds, depending on what you're trying to strive for audio quality. You can see though at phase 1, you're coming down here at about 30 to 35 microseconds. So it makes a big difference which version of P25 you're using. So when P25 first came out, for linear simulcast came out, you had very short, very small overlap areas, and so you had to you really control the audio, required more. Really control the signal, and it required more sites. Now pretty much everybody does LSM or the equivalent there. It makes a difference. Now the one thing that this chart doesn't show, which can lead you astray, is the tolerance for delay gets better as the signal strength gets better. So if you're doing a check and you get in an area where you've got really good signal strength, the receivers will tolerate the delay better in high signal strength areas. But then you go to an area that doesn't have so much signal strength and you got the same delay, and now it's not going to work. So you can get sort of faked out by that a little bit. So you think, oh well, it's working better than what the graph shows. Well, that's because you're in a high signal strength area, not down closer to where sort of the edge of performance of the radio. So one of the things that happened with a lot of people was when they switched to narrowbanding, they found that a lot of issues with the radios changed, and this happened in simulcast as well. So one of the advantages that FM has is that it allows the radio to sort of switch between two signal levels. And where you really notice this is in FM broadcast, right? So if you're driving along and for example, in our area, there's some of the stations use simulcast in FM broadcast, and you can hear the transition zone between where you're going from one site to the other. You can hear it sometimes, but it's very quick, right? It might only be just a quarter of a mile down the freeway while you're driving, and now you're into the new one, and it sounds the other side, and it sounds really good. But FM broadcast is really wide deviation, so capture effect works really well for broadcast. At 5 kilohertz deviation, it was starting to get to the point where, you had capture effect, but it wasn't like it says in the books where it's 6 dB. Now when you get down to 2.5 kilohertz deviation, the reality of it is that there's the capture effect almost goes away, because when you look at the mathematics of it, 2.5 kilohertz deviation is not really much better than AM when you look at noise reduction and all that. So, the advantage is you're transmitting full carrier all the time, which you don't with AM, but the advantages of going to FM almost go away when you go to narrow deviation like that. So, from a simulcast standpoint, the only place we really care about, it's not in the areas where we're close to one transmitter and we've got plenty of signal, and it's obviously we're being captured by sighting, right? that's a no-brainer. The place where we have problems is in the overlap area. And it's the overlap area that we have to manage, and it's the overlap area that we have to control. That's, and it's not the distance of the transmitters, right? I mean, you'll hear radio vendors sometimes say, well, put transmitters every 15 miles, and then you don't have to worry about simulcast. Well, that's not really true, number one. But number two, it's sort of the trivial approach, right? It's like, well, if we put enough transmitters all around, there's no overlap, and we don't exceed the limit, and there you go. But in most counties, putting 15 transmitters every 15 miles, you might as well use your cell phone, right? Because that's, you wouldn't be able to afford to do that. And so here's why we care about it, right? So believe it or not, you can actually measure the time it takes radio signals to transmit. We think they transmit at the speed of light, which is mostly right, but the speed of light is not infinite. And so as you can see, it takes 5.4 microseconds per mile for radio signals to travel. That's fast, but it's not infinite. So what happens is, what was our magic number before? 83 microseconds, right? So 83 microseconds is our magic number for you can't have, be out of phase or be out of timing more than 83 microseconds. Well, 10 miles is 54 microseconds, 20 miles is 108 microseconds, right? So we know somewhere in between. So if we look at the bottom there, you can see that there's an overlap area that's about 15.3 miles. You cannot have your overlap area larger than 15.3 miles, or a difference in time from the two sites, exceed 83 microseconds. I'll talk about that in just a second. So, I mean, it's all math, right? You can look it out in an area where you're going to have overlap. The problem is that you may not know, if you're out driving around and trying to do this, or you're trying to guess, you can be faked out by not knowing where it's at. You really need to do the work on a computer ahead of time. So here's an example right here. So we have a fire truck user. He's 2 miles from one site. It's 10 microseconds. He's 20 miles from the other site. This would be a fairly typical system, right? 20 miles, a couple sites. Difference is 97.2 microseconds, so that's outside the timing window. So as long as you're in capture from site, the close site there, 2 miles away, you're okay. But if you're outside of the capture, it's not okay. Okay, so you look at that and you say, well, I'd be within capture, right? Well, not necessarily, and maybe in West Texas where it's perfectly flat, or some other state, Kansas, where it's really flat, that might be true. But what happens if the fire truck, if the 2 mile site is on a mountaintop or a hill, and your fire truck's at the bottom of the hill, right? And now you're underneath that antenna, and you're in the pattern, the knoll in the pattern. But your line of sight to that site is 20 miles away. You can easily have more equal signal strength between those two sites. Now you're going to have an overlap problem. And this happens quite often in simulcast systems, right? You're right near, close to one site. You might even be able to see the site, right? It's just right there on the hill, but you're getting simulcast overlap interference from the site that's 20 miles away. And the other one is overpass, right? This site is maybe down low, it's kind of in the trees, you go up a freeway overpass, and now you can see line of sight to that site 20 miles away, and now the signal level comes way up, and now you've got overlap distortion. So here's one, right in the middle. So you get 20 miles and 22 miles from these two sites. Now, those sites at this point could be 40 miles apart, right? You're a long ways apart, but you're right in the middle. Your difference in coverage, in timing's 10 microseconds, everything's going to be okay. It doesn't matter whether you're in capture, it doesn't matter whether you're not in capture. However, the real world is usually a little more complicated. So usually what happens is you end up with this situation where you've got 3 sites, 4 sites, 5 sites. We've got counties that have 15 sites on their simulcast system, and they pick high sites. And so I'll show you an example here later. And so what happens is you end up with a situation where it becomes very difficult to balance how this works, right? So you get site A, 10, you get 54, 27, and 216 microseconds. So the difference for the site A and site B is 27 microseconds. You're in good shape, right? But if you can hear site C, and if the signal's strong enough, it's 189 microseconds out. That's way out, right? That's, I mean, you're not gonna, that's gonna totally distort that signal. So, so the thing is, when you do simulcast systems, I can always remind people, if you get high sites, you don't want wide coverage. You don't want splatter, you don't want that site to splatter all over the mountains and all that, which is typically, for years, how we design systems, right? You take a system and you know, now you got that 6,000 foot hill right outside of town, you put a repeater on it, covers the whole county, right? Well, then you want to improve coverage in town, so you put a couple more sites in towns, and then you fire up, you know, you fire it all up, simulcast, works great, except now you got overlap interference all over the place. So you really need to, our recommendation is you really need to spend time on the computer. You know, sometimes when we do some of these simulcast systems, we put, I mean, I personally will put 30, 35 hours of time on a complicated simulcast system, maybe even more, designing, you know, antenna patterns, doing all these different kinds of things. So our rule of thumb typically is we use 15 dB capture ratio. So, you know, if you pull out a little textbook, it tells you 6. And it doesn't really, maybe that might work in ideal conditions for broadcast. Our experience is in land mobile, especially narrowband, it doesn't work. So we use 15 dB and 80 microseconds for analog. Again, unless you've got some high frequency paging, right? If you've got high frequency paging, then you have to adjust that delay time. For C4FM, again, we still use a 15 dB capture ratio, and we use 30 microseconds as the maximum delay. But this, you know, sometimes this you get faked out in the P25 world because you've got other multi-path effects going on from bounces off mountains or whatever. And in LSM, we use 70 and we still use 15. So we found that works pretty well, but you still have to, you know, what I would say, use local knowledge. And what I mean is you spend some time with Google Earth. I mean, if you aren't already familiar with the area, you go through that and you know, look to say, okay, well, what do I think is going to happen with interference or delay? So, for example, even without simulcast, right, P25 can be a real problem in the multipath areas. We were involved in a project where a large state police agency was converting to P25, and they had a lot of areas where in analog they had kind of mushy audio, but they still had coverage. When they put in P25, the coverage went away. So they did a bunch of drive testing, and we found places where at signal level like minus 80 dBm, right? That's, I mean, the antenna catches on fire at minus 80 dBm. But they had an 8% bit error rate, and this is from a single site, right? Not simulcast. They had an 8% bit error rate. Well, the P25 radios don't work, and so you know, it was a surprise, right? Because they had never really looked at that, and most of the software doesn't really calculate, you know, bit error rate. You can do some things to sort of estimate whether you think it's going to be a problem or not, but it's when you with P25 it can really be a problem. Then you add simulcast on top of it, it could be more complex. So here's a project we did. So this is a coverage prediction. So this is a 15 site system. You can see the county. What you can't see here is that this is Interstate 5 right here. This is in a valley. This whole middle part is in a valley. These are all high mountains all around here, and 6,000 or 7,000 feet. And in the valley, you know, it's basically sea level. So, you know, it's fairly rugged terrain. And these sites, like this one right here, just, you know, if you look at that site by itself, it's got, you know, you look at all these different mountaintops, you see coverage from that site all over the county. So, you know, they put this system in, I don't know, 15 or 20 years ago. It wasn't one of our projects. And we got called in to review it. They've got this master 3s and old T800s, so they, you know, need to upgrade their equipment. But, so we do the coverage predictions and we say, okay, they're complaining about simulcast overlap. Well, here's what happens when you put the overlap overlay. All these black areas that had good signal strength now have overlap. And so the audio was terrible in most of those areas. It was unusable. And some of these areas, like this area right here,
Right up here, this is populated area, small towns, and it's right along Interstate 5. This area here was fairly populated. It was a kind of a big town right here. And then this area here there was quite a bit of suburban area in there as well. And so you can see that even though they have all these sites, and we go back to the other one, and it looked like there was all this coverage, the reality of it is it wasn't usable. So one of the things we recommended was that they use down tilt, and so we've used down tilt on antennas, and when we talk about down tilt, we're not talking about 3 or 4 degrees, right? That's virtually no down tilt. If you really look at an antenna pattern, and I know a couple years ago I did a talk on this, if you really look at an antenna pattern, 3 or 4 degrees really doesn't buy you anything. It really doesn't hardly even buy anything at the horizon for interference protection. What we're talking about here is down tilt. This is VHF, down tilt in 10 or 12 degrees. You need that kind of down tilt. And even if you have low sites, you want to drive that signal on the ground. You don't want RF 20 or 30 miles away when you're doing a simulcast system. Unless you're controlling it, right? Like if it's doing a transmitter there and it's blasting out and there's no other overlap, then maybe you can get away with it. But so you can see in this case that we had also adjusted power. A couple of the sites, or at least one of the sites anyway, we went all the way down to 10 watts. We have another, so that's the other thing about simulcast, right? Get the 100-watt transmitter, all that stuff out of your mind, because most times you don't want all that power. In fact, we did a system about 10 years ago now. It's 11 site, it was now it's 13 sites. Was it 10 channels? And the average, because it's a portable based system, right? It's VHF, and they use mobiles, but the reality of it is that the officers, want to use portables. That on that system, the average transmit power, ERP, is in the 10 to 20 watt range. And the reason, of course, is really good. If you got a 5-watt portable, right, what good does it do to transmit at 100 watts? You end up with an alligator, right? It's all mouth and no ears, and you can't use the, you can't transmit. I mean, you can't. The system's unbalanced, right? So the user hears the signal, but they can't get back in. It's very frustrating. So you want to balance the signal levels. So in this case, we had to come way down. I mean, the power levels had to come down, and you can see at least we still have overlap, right? Because their sites are too high. But you can see in some of these areas here that were really bad before, we were able to pretty dramatically improve it. One of those areas, the only way they're going to fix the problem is they have to put another transmitter site, a low power, low level transmitter site. So. Again, the issue, and so the improvements that we made, so definitely reduce the overlap interference with the down tilt and the transmitter reduction. However, if you look at those two plots, you notice we also reduced coverage, right? Some of those mountainous areas didn't have the coverage that they had before. I mean, you can't have it both ways, right? So the system was never really designed properly originally for simulcast. They wanted to use high mountains to get wide area coverage, but you can't do that without some very careful engineering on simulcast. So here's a plot that shows what the difference makes. So this is a site that we showed the difference if you have a 10-degree down tilt. So that it shows the difference between a non-down tilt antenna and a down tilt antenna. So if you look at the pink areas, that shows that the standard antenna signal is higher than the antenna with down tilt, and the yellow and orange areas are where the down tilt antenna signal was higher. And the sites right here. So you can see the difference, right? So all that area is white is basically the area where the signal's about the same. So the area where, if you kind of look at close into the site where there's houses and some development stuff, that site covers that area. It was intended to cover that area at the site. But you can see that without down tilt, look at the coverage. It's providing coverage clear out all over the place, right? And you just can't control that in simulcast. It's too far away. It's too many places where you have overlap. You just can't manage it. So you have to try to manage your signal power. So let's talk about driving, right? My experience is, and believe me, I've been doing this a long time, and I've had to learn the hard way, it's really almost impossible to make a simulcast system sound right by tweaking and driving, right? Unless you own stock in, XXII, and you want to buy a lot of gas, you can do it, a two-site system, and sometimes some systems are trivial, or you have one area you want to try to improve, you don't care about other areas, you can kind of do it by ear in analog. In digital, of course, because you don't know if you're getting better or not, it just either works or doesn't. In digital, it's really difficult to do that. I mean, it's probably just luck if you happen to actually do it. So you really need to spend some time doing this on the computer, adjusting the timings, adjusting antenna patterns, adjusting power levels, and then of course, computers are all, I always tell the predictions are all a house of cards anyway, right? Because the computer only sort of simulates maybe partially real life, and so you still might have to do some tweaks when you get out there. But sometimes with in digital, to do that, you probably have to do bit error rate testing. And so that means you either have to have a test set that does bit error rates, or some radios you can put them in a mode where you can read bit error rate out of it with special software. And then like I said, sometimes you can make some minor adjustments based on typically power level or some minor timing adjustments based on the actual conditions. But if you start to get to the point where you're making an adjustment here and it doesn't sound good, you run over here, make another adjustment, and you run over here, make another adjustment, stop, right? Because all you're doing is, it's like a balloon, right? You push on one side of the balloon and it pops out somewhere else. You're just going to chase your tail. So stop, go back, and sit down at the computer and figure out, what's actually going on. If you go out and do some measurements and you say, well, this site, computer says it should be minus 90 at this site, but I'm actually measuring minus 85, then go back in the computer and correct, those values and rerun the numbers again. It's just, it's 24 hours of time sitting in your office running the computer is a lot less expensive than spending 2 weeks driving around in an expensive truck, burning up fuel. And you probably, at the end of 2 weeks, you'll probably just be frustrated and still won't have solved the problem. So that's it.